Welcome to my Channel Deep Sleep Mission-DSM. As we begin, I would be delighted if you could share your location in the comments below. It's truly inspiring to witness how far this content travels and to connect with viewers from across the world. You know that feeling when you're alone at night and suddenly every shadow seems alive? That's exactly what I felt 3 weeks ago when my cat, Whiskers, started staring at the empty corner of my bedroom. Every single night. At exactly 2:47 a.m., what happened next still makes my hands shake as I type this, and I need to tell someone before it's too late, because whatever Whiskers sees in that corner, it's not staying there anymore. The story begins now. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and I live alone in a small rental house just outside Burlington, Vermont. Well, not completely alone. I have Whiskers, my 3-year-old tabby cat who's been my only companion since I moved here for my remote job last fall. The house is nothing special. A 1-story ranch built in the 70s with creaky hardwood floors and windows that rattle when the wind picks up. The walls are painted in that peculiar shade of beige that landlords seem to buy in bulk, and there's a persistent smell of old wood and something vaguely floral from whatever air freshener the previous tenant used. But the rent was cheap, and the landlord, Mr. Garrison, seemed nice enough. He even said I could have a pet without the usual deposit. The neighborhood was quiet, too quiet, I'd later realize. The kind of place where you'd expect to hear kids playing or dogs barking, but instead there was just this perpetual hush, like the whole street was holding its breath. My nearest neighbor was an elderly woman who kept her curtains drawn and only came out to collect her mail. Everything was normal for the first 2 months. Whiskers would sleep at the foot of my bed, occasionally waking me up at ungodly hours demanding food or attention. He had this routine where he'd pat my face with his paw until I got up to fill his bowl. Then he'd take 3 bites and go back to sleep. Typical cat behavior. Nothing out of the ordinary. Then it started. 3 weeks ago, on a Tuesday night, I woke up to find Whiskers sitting perfectly still at the edge of my bed. His green eyes were fixed on the far corner of my room, right next to my closet. The way he sat there, completely motionless, except for the slight twitch of his tail, it made my skin crawl. "What is it, buddy?" I whispered, my voice still thick with sleep. He didn't even acknowledge me. Just kept staring at that empty corner like his life depended on it. I checked my phone, 2:47 a.m. Great. I squinted at the corner, trying to see what had captured his attention. Nothing. Just shadows cast by the streetlight filtering through my curtains. The corner itself was unremarkable, just where 2 walls met, with a small cobweb I'd been meaning to clean stretched across the ceiling. Maybe a spider? Cats can see things we can't, right? Their vision is different. I even turned on my phone's flashlight, sweeping it across the corner. Still nothing, just peeling paint and that persistent cobweb swaying slightly in some imperceptible draft. After about 10 minutes of this bizarre standoff, Whiskers suddenly relaxed, stretched, and curled up next to me like nothing had happened. But I noticed he positioned himself between me and that corner, his body a small, furry barrier. I chalked it up to random cat weirdness and went back to sleep. The next night, same thing. 2:47 a.m., Whiskers was up, staring at that exact same spot. This time, I was more awake. I watched him watching the corner, noting how his pupils were fully dilated despite the ambient light from the street. His ears were pinned back slightly, and I could see the muscles in his shoulders tensed, ready to spring. But spring at what? By the 4th night, I was starting to get creeped out. I mean, cats are weird, sure, but this was too consistent, too specific. The exact same time, the exact same corner, the exact same intense focus. I started setting an alarm for 2:45 a.m., wanting to be fully awake when it happened. I'd prop myself up on my pillows, watching Whiskers sleep peacefully. Then, like clockwork, at 2:47 his eyes would snap open. He'd rise slowly, deliberately, and assume his position. I tried everything. I moved his cat tower to block the corner. He just sat on top of it and continued staring. I put a lamp there, thinking maybe the extra light would help. Nope. The bulb actually flickered a few times, which only made things worse. I even sprinkled some catnip in the opposite corner to distract him. He ignored it completely. I researched online. Found forums about cats staring at walls, seeing ghosts, sensing electromagnetic fields. Most people said it was normal. Cats being cats, but none of their cats did it at the exact same time every night. On the 7th night, I decided to document it. I set up my phone to record, propping it against some books on my nightstand. Maybe I could catch something on camera that I was missing. 2:47 a.m. came. Whiskers assumed his position, but when I checked the recording the next morning, something strange happened. The video was corrupted. Well, not exactly corrupted. The timestamp showed it had recorded for the full 30 minutes I'd set it for. But the actual footage only showed about 10 seconds of Whiskers staring before cutting to black. The audio continued, though, and I could hear myself breathing, the house settling, and something else. A sound so faint I had to put on headphones and max out the volume to hear it, like fabric brushing against wood, or maybe fingernails dragging across the wall. But there was something else in the audio. Something I didn't notice until I'd listened to it for the 3rd time. Right at the moment the video cut to black, there was this subtle shift in the ambient sound, like the air pressure had changed. And underneath my breathing, underneath the house sounds, there was the faintest whisper. Not words, exactly. More like an exhalation that had shape to it. I told myself it was just the house. Old houses make weird noises. The heating system, pipes expanding and contracting. Totally normal. But then I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The scratches. They were subtle at first. Just thin lines in the paint near the baseboard in that corner. I probably would have never noticed them if I wasn't already obsessing over that spot. 3 parallel marks, about 6 inches long, starting about a foot from the floor. Fresh scratches. The paint dust was still on the hardwood. My first thought was Whiskers, but these marks were too high for him to reach from the floor, and there was nothing for him to climb on in that corner. Plus, I'd been watching him every night. He never moved from his sentinel position on the bed. I called my landlord, Mr. Garrison, trying to keep my voice casual. "Hey, Mr. Garrison. Sorry to bother you, but I noticed some scratches on the wall in my bedroom. Just wanted to let you know in case it affects my security deposit." There was a long pause on the other end. So long, I thought the call had dropped. "What corner?" His voice was different, tighter. The one by the closet, in the bedroom." Another pause. "I'll send someone to paint over it. Don't worry about the deposit." He hung up before I could say anything else. That night, I barely slept. Even before 2:47 rolled around, I was on edge. When Whiskers took his position, I watched the corner too. Really watched it. Not just a glance, but a focused stare, trying to see what he saw. And that's when I noticed it. The temperature drop. It was subtle, maybe just a few degrees, but in that corner, the air was definitely colder. I could see my breath if I got close enough, which I didn't want to do. The scratches were getting longer. Each morning, they'd extended another inch or two, and now there were more sets. 4, 5, I stopped counting. I started sleeping on the couch. Told myself it was because my back was hurting, but really, I just couldn't stand being in that room anymore. Whiskers, loyal as ever, would pad out to check on me around 2:30, then return to his vigil. It was on day 10 that things escalated. I was in the kitchen, making coffee and trying to wake up after another restless night on the couch, when I heard it. A solid thump from my bedroom. like something heavy had fallen. I grabbed a knife from the drawer. Not that I thought it would help against whatever, but holding it made me feel slightly less helpless. I crept down the hallway, my bare feet silent on the cold floor. The bedroom door was closed. I always left it open. My hand shook as I reached for the knob. The metal was ice cold, burning my palm. I turned it slowly, pushing the door open inch by inch. Whiskers was in his usual spot, but his fur was standing on end, making him look twice his size. His eyes weren't on the corner, though. They were tracking something. Moving slowly from the corner, along the wall, towards the closet. I followed his gaze and nearly dropped the knife. The scratches had spread. Not just longer now, but spreading out like cracks in glass. They covered half the wall, reaching up toward the ceiling in jagged, organic patterns. And in the center of it all, where the corner met the floor, was a dark stain. It looked wet. I backed out of the room, grabbed Whiskers despite his protests, and left the house. I sat in my car for an hour, debating whether to call the police. And tell them what? That my cat was acting weird and there were scratches on my wall. When I finally worked up the courage to go back inside, I found a note slipped under my front door. "Stop watching it, Mr. Garrison." I should have left, packed up that day and found somewhere else to live. But where would I go? I'd signed a lease, used most of my savings for the security deposit and first month's rent. And what would I tell people? That I was scared of scratches on a wall? So I stayed, and I started researching. The Burlington Public Library had old newspapers on microfilm. I spent hours scrolling through decades of local news, looking for anything about my rental house. The address didn't turn up much. A few property transfers, building permits, normal stuff. But then I found something. Not about my house specifically, but about the neighborhood. In 1987, 3 houses on my street had reported similar incidents. Unexplained scratches, cold spots, pets acting aggressively towards empty spaces. The articles were brief, buried in the back pages. They stopped abruptly after 2 months. I tracked down one of the homeowners from those articles, Mrs. Eleanor Davies, now in her 80s and living in a retirement community across town. When I mentioned the scratches, her face went pale. "You need to leave," she said, gripping my hand with surprising strength. "Don't wait like we did. Don't let it get stronger." "Let what get stronger?" She shook her head, lips pressed tight. "It feeds on attention. The more you watch, the more real it becomes. We learned that too late." "What happened?" "The Peterson boy." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "He was found in his room. They said it was an accident, that he'd scratched himself somehow. But those marks..." She shuddered. "No human could make marks like that." I left the retirement home with more questions than answers. But one thing was clear. I needed to stop watching that corner. Easier said than done. That night, I blindfolded myself before bed. If I couldn't see Whiskers staring, maybe I could ignore it. Maybe I could break whatever cycle we were trapped in. 2:47 a.m. came. I felt Whiskers move to his position. Every instinct screamed at me to look, to rip off the blindfold and check the corner. But I forced myself to lie still, to breathe evenly, to pretend I was asleep. The scratching sound was louder without my sight, like claws on a chalkboard, rhythmic and deliberate. I bit my lip to keep from crying out, then I felt it. The bed dipped slightly, as if something had put weight on the edge, right where Whiskers should be. But I could still feel Whiskers next to me, his fur brushing against my leg. Something else was on my bed. My phone buzzed. A text at 2:52 a.m. from Mr. Garrison. "Don't move, don't make a sound, it's almost over." The weight on the bed shifted. Closer. I could smell something now. like wet earth and copper. The air grew so cold I could feel ice forming on my blindfold from my breath. A sound next to my ear. Not breathing exactly, more like wind through a narrow space. Whistling, almost melodic. Whiskers hissed. A sound I'd never heard him make before. Primal and terrified. The weight vanished. The temperature normalized. The scratching stopped. I ripped off the blindfold. The room was empty except for me and Whiskers. But the wall, the scratches had formed words. Now, I see you too. I didn't sleep for the next 48 hours. I packed a bag, grabbed Whiskers, and checked into a motel on the other side of town. But even there, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. That whatever had been confined to that corner was now free. Mr. Garrison called repeatedly. I didn't answer. Until finally, he left a voicemail. "Sarah, I know you're scared. But you need to come back. It's not finished with you. Running will only make it worse. Please, let me explain." Against every instinct, I met him at a diner the next morning. He looked haggard, older than when I'd first met him. His hands shook as he stirred sugar into his coffee. "My daughter lived in that house," he began without preamble. 20 years ago, she was about your age. Had a cat, too." I waited, my own coffee growing cold. She started seeing things. Or rather, not seeing things. Just shadows, movements in her peripheral vision. The cat would stare at empty spaces. Sound familiar? I nodded. I didn't believe her. Thought it was stress from her job, maybe sleep deprivation. But then the scratches started. He pulled out his phone, showed me old photos. The same wall, the same corner, the same spreading pattern of marks. She became obsessed. Started sleeping in that room even though she was terrified. Said she needed to watch it to make sure it didn't move. I tried to get her to leave, but she wouldn't. Said it would follow her. What happened to her? His voice cracked. One night, she called me, 2:47 a.m., screaming about how it was in the room with her, how it had been watching her watch it, learning from her. I rushed over, but he didn't need to finish. I could see it in his eyes. The official cause was a heart attack, but the scratches on her arms. He shook his head. After that, I couldn't sell the house, couldn't let another family move in, so I started renting it out, short-term mostly. People would leave after a few weeks and the cycle would reset. But why didn't you warn me? Because warning people makes it worse. The knowledge, the fear, it feeds on that too. The only way to survive is to ignore it completely, to pretend it doesn't exist. Most people do that naturally. They explain away the oddness, rationalize the fear. But some people, he looked at me meaningfully. Some people can't help but look. So what do I do now? You go back, you face it, and you end it. How? He pulled out an old key. In the basement, behind the water heater, there's a box. My daughter's things. She was researching, too, near the end. Maybe she found something. I took the key. Why don't you get it yourself? Because I can't go back there. Haven't been able to since. He stood, dropped money on the table. 2:47 a.m., Sarah. That's when the boundary is thinnest. That's your window. I wanted to ask more, but he was already leaving. And I knew, deep down, that I would go back. Not because I was brave, but because I could feel it. That connection. Like an invisible thread pulling me back to that house. That night, I stood outside my rental, key in hand. Whiskers was in his carrier in the car, meowing pitifully. I'd drop him at a friend's place after this. Whatever happened, he'd been through enough. The house felt different. Heavier. Like the air itself was thick with anticipation. I went straight to the basement, found the box behind the water heater. Inside were journals, printed emails, research notes, and a letter addressed to whoever comes next. I read it by flashlight, my hands trembling. If you're reading this, it's already seen you, and you've seen it, or almost seen it. That's how it works. It exists in the spaces between seeing and not seeing. In that moment, when your eye catches movement, but your brain hasn't processed it yet. I think it was always here, before the houses, before the town, waiting in corners, in the places where walls meet, where shadows gather. We built around it, trapped it without knowing. But every time someone notices it, it gets a little more real. Every stare, every moment of fear, it feeds and grows. There's only one way to stop it. You have to see it, really see it, not just glimpse it or sense it. You have to look directly at what can't be looked at. 2:47 a.m., that's when it's strongest, but also when it's most vulnerable. When it reaches from its world into ours. I'm going to try tonight. If you're reading this, I failed, but maybe I weakened it. Maybe the next person. The entry ended there. I looked at my phone. 11:30 p.m. 3 hours and 17 minutes. I went to my bedroom. The scratches had spread to the ceiling now, covering the entire corner in a web of marks. In the center, that dark stain had grown. It looked like a hole, but not through the wall. Through something else. I sat on the bed in Whisker's spot and waited. At 2:47 a.m. exactly, I saw it. Not from the corner of my eye. Not as a shadow or suggestion. I saw it fully, completely, as it pulled itself through that stain in reality. I can't describe it. Not because I don't remember, but because human language wasn't meant for such things. It was absence given form. A thing that existed by not existing. When I looked at it, I felt my own existence flicker. But I didn't look away. And in that moment of perfect, terrible clarity, I understood. It wasn't malevolent. It was hungry. Hungry for reality, for substance, for the weight of being seen. Every person who glimpsed it, who fed it their attention and fear, gave it a little more presence in our world. But seeing it fully, that was different. Because when I truly saw it, it had to see me. And in seeing me, it saw what it could never be. Solid, real, bounded by flesh and physics. The thing let out a sound, not a scream, more like reality itself groaning. And then it collapsed. Not dramatically, it simply stopped. Like a song ending, like a breath released. The scratches on the walls faded. The cold dissipated. The stain shrunk until it was just a discoloration that could have been water damage or a trick of the light. I sat there until dawn, afraid to move, afraid it might come back, but it was gone. Really gone. I moved out a week later. Mr. Garrison didn't charge me for breaking the lease. He had the corner repainted, the walls repaired. New tenants moved in last week. They seemed nice. Normal. I drive by sometimes. Can't help myself. Their cat, a little black and white thing, sleeps peacefully through the night. But sometimes I wake up at 2:47 a.m. in my new apartment, and I find myself staring at corners, wondering if there are other things waiting there, things that exist in the spaces we don't quite see. Whiskers sleeps through the night now, curled up next to me, purring softly, but every once in a while I catch him looking at something I can't see. And I wonder if it's really over, or if some things can never truly be unseen. So, I need to ask you something. And please, answer honestly in the comments. Have you ever noticed your pet staring at empty spaces? Have you ever felt like something was watching you from the corners of your room? Because if you have, well, maybe you should start paying attention to what time it happens. And maybe, just maybe, you should try very hard not to look back. Let me know your experiences below. I read every comment, And if you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Because the things that hide in the corners of our world, they're always waiting for someone to notice them. Sleep tight.
Story number 2.
Listen carefully, because what I'm about to tell you might save your life, or at least your sanity. You know that feeling when something's wrong in your house, but you can't quite put your finger on it? That nagging sensation that makes the hair on your neck stand up for no reason? Well, I had that feeling for 3 months before I finally understood what was happening. And by then, it was almost too late. If your thermostat ever starts changing on its own, if it goes to exactly 67 degrees every single night, don't wait, don't investigate, just leave. Pack whatever you can carry and get out. Because once it really starts, there's no going back. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you how it began. Let me tell you about the house on Maple Street, and why I'll never sleep soundly again. The story begins now. I remember the day I moved into 4821 Maple Street like it was yesterday. October 15th, a crisp Tuesday morning in suburban Minneapolis. The leaves were turning that perfect shade of burnt orange that only happens in the Midwest. And I was finally, a homeowner at 32. The house wasn't much to look at from the outside. A modest 2-story colonial built in 1978. Beige siding that needed a fresh coat of paint, and a slightly overgrown lawn that the previous owners had neglected. But it was mine. After years of cramped apartments and noisy neighbors, I had my own space, my own walls, my own thermostat. God, if only I'd known. The first few weeks were perfect. I spent my evenings unpacking boxes, arranging furniture, making the space feel like home. The house had good bones, solid hardwood floors that creaked in all the right places, large windows that let in plenty of natural light, and a finished basement that I planned to turn into a home office. Everything was normal, wonderfully, blissfully normal. The thermostat was one of those newer smart models, a Nest that the previous owners had installed. I remember being excited about it. I could control the temperature from my phone, set schedules, save on energy bills. Modern technology at its finest. I had it programmed to drop to 65 at night for sleeping, then warm up to 72 in the morning before my alarm went off. Simple, efficient, exactly what I wanted. The first time I noticed something odd was November 3rd, a Sunday night. I woke up around 3 a.m. Not unusual for me since I sometimes have trouble sleeping in new places, but something felt different. The air had a strange quality to it. Not quite cold, not quite warm, but somehow wrong. I grabbed my phone from the nightstand and opened the Nest app. 67 degrees. That wasn't right. I distinctly remembered setting it to 65. Maybe I'd made a mistake. Half asleep. I adjusted it back and didn't think much of it. But the next night, it happened again. 3 a.m., wide awake. That same strange feeling in the air. I checked the app. 67 degrees. This time, I was more alert, more confused. I definitely hadn't touched the thermostat. I'd been at work all day. Came home, had dinner, watched some Netflix, went to bed. The usual routine. So, why was it changing? I adjusted it back to 65 and made a mental note to check the settings in the morning. Maybe there was some kind of learning feature I didn't know about. These smart thermostats were supposed to adapt to your preferences, right? The pattern continued. Every single night, without fail, I'd wake up at 3 a.m. to find the temperature at exactly 67 degrees. Not 66, not 68. Always 67. I tried everything. I reset the device to factory settings, changed my password in case someone was messing with me. Even called Nest support, though they were less than helpful. Sometimes these devices develop quirks, the technician said. Try replacing it if the issue persists. But I was stubborn and cheap. The thermostat was barely 2 years old according to the previous owners. It seemed wasteful to replace it over such a minor inconvenience. So I dealt with it. Started setting it to 63 before bed, knowing it would bump up to 67. Problem solved, right, wrong. So very, very wrong. By December, I'd almost gotten used to the nightly temperature change. It had become part of my routine, like brushing my teeth or setting my alarm. But then I started noticing other things. Small things at first. Things that seemed unconnected. The house would settle at night in ways that didn't quite sound like normal settling. You know how houses make noise, especially older ones. The pipes expanding and contracting, the wood creaking as temperatures change. All perfectly normal. But these sounds were different, rhythmic almost, like breathing. I'd also started having the strangest dreams. Not nightmares exactly, but unsettling. I'd dream I was lying in bed, unable to move, while someone stood in the doorway watching me. Just a silhouette against the hallway light. Never moving, never speaking, just watching. The rational part of my brain knew it was just sleep paralysis. Stress from the new house, the new mortgage payments, the responsibility of homeownership. But the dreams felt so real, so specific, and they only happened when the temperature was at 67. That's when I decided to do some research, not on thermostats or sleep paralysis, but on the house itself. 4821 Maple Street. What was its history? Who had lived here before? The records at the library were sparse, but what I found made my blood run cold. The house had been built in 1978 by a family named the Johnsons. Normal enough. They'd lived there for 15 years, raised 2 kids, then moved to Florida for retirement. The next owners, the Nguyens, had stayed for 8 years, then the Patel family for 5, then the Andersons for 3, then the Morettis for 2, then the previous owners, the Carters, for less than a year. Do you see the pattern? Each family stayed for a shorter period than the last, and the Carters, who'd seemed so eager to sell when I toured the house, had barely lived here 10 months. I dug deeper, searched old newspaper archives, checked online forums, and finally, buried in a neighborhood Facebook group from 6 years ago, I found a post that made my hands shake. Anyone else on Maple Street having issues with their thermostat? Ours keeps changing to 67 degrees every night, starting to freak me out. Oh, Jennifer Moretti. The comments were what you'd expect, jokes about ghosts, suggestions to call an electrician. But one comment stood out. From a user named Michael Chen. Same thing happened when we lived at 4821. 67 degrees every night at 3 a.m. We moved out after my daughter started having nightmares about someone in her room. My mouth went dry. The Chens weren't on my list of previous owners. I searched property records again and found them. They'd owned the house for only 4 months in 2017, between the Patel family and the Andersons. 4 months. That's it. I needed to know more. I had to understand what was happening in my house, my home, the place where I was supposed to feel safe. I reached out to Michael Chen through Facebook. His profile was sparse, but he was still active. I sent him a message explaining that I'd bought 4821 Maple Street and was experiencing the same thermostat issue. Asked if we could talk. He responded within an hour. I'm sorry you bought that house. Can we talk on the phone? There are things you need to know. My hands trembled as I dialed his number. He answered on the first ring. You need to get out, he said without preamble. I'm serious. Pack your things and leave. What? Why? It's just a thermostat glitch. It's not. His voice was strained, frightened, even after all these years. The thermostat is just the beginning. Has it started yet? The dreams? The feeling of being watched? my silence was answer enough. "Listen to me very carefully," he continued. 67 degrees isn't random. I did research, lots of research after we left. That house, something happened there, before it was built. The land, it's wrong somehow." "What do you mean wrong?" He sighed. "In 1952, before the suburb was developed, there was a small facility on that land, a private medical facility. They treated patients with severe mental illnesses, experimental treatments, the kind they didn't talk about in polite company." My skin prickled. "And the facility burned down in 1961. Electrical fire started in the basement. 23 patients died. They couldn't get out. The doors were locked, standard procedure back then. They all died from smoke inhalation. And the temperature in the building when the fire department finally got inside, the thermometers that survived showed 67 degrees. I couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. I don't know why it happens," Michael continued. "I don't know if it's the patients or something else. But every family that's lived in that house has experienced the same thing. The temperature changes. The dreams get worse. And then what? Then people start seeing things, hearing things. My daughter, she was 8. She started talking about the sad people in the walls, said they were cold, always so cold. We left the next day. After I hung up, I sat in my living room for hours. The rational part of me said it was ridiculous, ghost stories, urban legends, confirmation bias making me see patterns that weren't there. But as night fell, as bedtime approached, I found myself dreading the moment when the temperature would change, when I'd wake up at 3 a.m. to find my house at exactly 67 degrees. I considered staying awake, watching the thermostat, seeing if I could catch the moment it changed, but exhaustion won out. I'd been sleeping poorly for weeks, and my body demanded rest. I went to bed at 11, set my phone to record video of the thermostat, and waited for the inevitable. 3 a.m. came like clockwork, but this time, something was different. I woke not to the usual strange feeling in the air, but to sounds, whispers, soft, indistinct, but undeniably there, coming from inside the walls. I lay frozen in bed, every muscle tense, straining to make out words, but it was like trying to understand a conversation underwater. Muffled, distorted, wrong. My phone was still recording the thermostat downstairs. I wanted to check it, wanted to see if it had captured the moment of change, but that would mean getting out of bed, walking past the walls where the whispers seemed loudest, and I wouldn't move. The whispers continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Then silence. Absolute silence, the kind that feels heavy, oppressive, like the house itself was holding its breath. That's when I saw it, a shadow in the doorway, just like in my dreams. But I was awake, fully, terrifyingly awake. The shadow didn't move, didn't speak, but I could feel it watching me, studying me, waiting. I squeezed my eyes shut, told myself it wasn't real, just sleep deprivation. Stress, Michael Chen's story playing tricks on my mind. When I opened them again, the doorway was empty, but the feeling remained. That sense of being observed, catalogued, like a specimen under a microscope. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. At first light, I retrieved my phone and reviewed the recording. What I saw made no sense. At 2:59 a.m., the display showed 65 degrees. At 3 a.m., it flickered. Not to 66, then 67. Not gradually. The entire display went black for a fraction of a second, and when it came back, 67 degrees. I called in sick to work. Spent the day researching the old medical facility Michael had mentioned. Found old newspaper clippings about the fire. 23 patients, just like he'd said. But the articles mentioned something else. Something Michael hadn't told me. The facility had been experimenting with temperature therapy. extreme cold treatments for various mental conditions. The theory was that lowering body temperature could calm manic episodes, reduce hallucinations, even cure certain disorders. The patients who died, they'd been in the middle of a treatment when the fire started, locked in cold rooms, unable to escape. The head doctor, a man named Richard Thornberry, had been investigated after the fire. Not for negligence, but for continuing the experiments even after several patients had died during treatment. The investigation was dropped when he disappeared 3 days after the fire. Never seen again. That night, I tried something different. I disconnected the thermostat entirely. Figured if there was no power, nothing could change the temperature. I'd suffer through one night without heat. It was worth it for peace of mind. But at 3 a.m., I woke to whispers again. Louder this time. More insistent. And the air, despite no active heating system, was exactly 67 degrees. I know because I'd bought 3 different thermometers and placed them around my bedroom. All 3 showed the same impossible temperature. The shadow in the doorway was back, but this time, it wasn't alone. Shapes moved in my peripheral vision, dark figures that disappeared when I turned to look directly at them. The whispers grew louder, still indistinct but desperate, pleading, and then, for just a moment, I understood one word, clear as day. Cold. I ran, threw on clothes, grabbed my car keys and ran. Spent the rest of the night in my car in a Walmart parking lot, called in sick again the next day, sat in a coffee shop until it closed, then another Walmart parking lot. I couldn't go back, wouldn't go back, but I had to. My life was in that house, my belongings, my mortgage payments, everything I'd worked for. I couldn't just abandon it because of some... What? Ghosts? Hallucinations? A faulty thermostat and an overactive imagination? So I went back, in broad daylight, with a friend, Jake from work, who thought I was having some kind of breakdown but agreed to help me pack some essentials. I told him I was having the house inspected for mold, something that might cause hallucinations. He bought it. The house felt different during the day. Normal, safe even. Jake helped me pack clothes, toiletries, my laptop. We were in and out in 30 minutes. No whispers, no shadows, no mysterious temperature changes. Place seems fine to me, Jake said as we loaded my car. You sure you're not just stressed about the move, first house and all that? I forced a laugh. Yeah, probably. Better safe than sorry, though. That night, in my hotel room, I got a text from an unknown number. Just an address, 1847 Industrial Boulevard, nothing else. I almost deleted it, probably spam. But something made me pause. The address, it seemed familiar. I pulled up Google Maps and my blood went cold. 1847 Industrial Boulevard was half a mile from my house. The location, according to historical maps I'd found, where the medical facility had stood, where 23 patients had died, where Dr. Richard Thornberry had conducted his experiments. There was nothing there now, just an empty lot according to Street View. But someone had sent me that address, someone who knew I'd understand its significance. Against every instinct, I had to go see it. I arrived at the empty lot just after sunset. It was exactly what Google had shown. A patch of overgrown grass and weeds surrounded by chain-link fence. A faded "No Trespassing" sign hung at an angle. Beyond it, nothing but dead vegetation and scattered trash. But something drew me forward, made me climb that fence despite my better judgment. The moment my feet hit the ground on the other side, the temperature dropped. Not gradually, instantly. My breath came out in visible puffs. I pulled out my phone. 67 degrees. Even here, in this empty lot. 67 degrees. That's when I noticed the foundation, barely visible beneath decades of overgrowth. Concrete blocks outlined where the building had stood. I followed them, traced the perimeter, until I found what I somehow knew would be there, stairs. leading down, the basement, where the cold rooms had been, where 23 patients had died. I should have left. Every rational part of my brain screamed at me to run, but I descended those stairs. Had to. The answers were down there. I was sure of it. The basement was more intact than I'd expected. Concrete walls blackened by ancient fire damage, rusted metal doors hanging off their hinges, and cold. So impossibly cold, but exactly 67 degrees according to my phone. I made my way deeper, past rooms that might have been cells, past rusted medical equipment I didn't want to identify, until I reached the far wall, and there, scratched into the concrete, were names. 23 names. But at the bottom, separate from the others, one more name. Dr. Richard Thornberry. He hadn't disappeared after the fire. He'd come back, to the place where his life's work had ended in tragedy, and he'd never left. You understand now. The voice came from behind me. I spun around to find an elderly man in a worn white coat, but I could see through him, see the wall behind, the shadow from my doorway, but clearer now, more defined. Dr. Thornberry? He nodded slowly. I've been waiting for someone who would listen, who would understand. The temperature, 67 degrees. The optimal temperature for the treatment. I was so close to a breakthrough, but the fire, it ruined everything. Took my patience, took my work, took my life. His form flickered. I tried to save them. When the fire started, I ran to the cold rooms, but the locks, the automatic locks I'd installed for safety, they wouldn't open. The power had failed. You died in the fire too. 3 days after, I came back here. Couldn't live with what I'd done, what I'd failed to do. I took my own life in this very room, and I've been here ever since. But part of me, part of us all, we're connected to that land, to every building they put on top of our graves, the houses, the thermostat changes. We're trying to tell them, trying to make them understand. 67 degrees, always 67, the temperature that killed them, the temperature that haunts us all. He stepped closer and I could feel the cold radiating from him, but no one listens. They all leave, run away, let us fade into obscurity, forgotten. What do you want from me? Remember us, that's all. Remember that we lived, that we died, that we were more than just victims of a fire. We were people. Patients seeking help. A doctor trying to heal. Remember. The form began to fade. The basement grew darker, colder. I ran, up the stairs, over the fence, to my car, but his words followed me. Remember us. I never went back to the house on Maple Street, took the financial hit, let the bank foreclose, moved to another state, started over, but I kept my promise. I remember them, all 23 patients whose names were carved in that wall, and Dr. Richard Thornberry, whose guilt bound them all to that place. I researched each one, found their stories, their families, their lives before the facility. Margaret Chen, who loved to paint before the voices started. Thomas Martinez, who wrote poetry between treatments. Sarah Johnson, barely 18 when she was admitted. All of them. Real people, not just ghosts, not just whispers in the walls. The house on Maple Street still stands, still gets sold every year or two to unsuspecting buyers. And every night at 3 a.m., the thermostat changes to 67 degrees. The whispers start, the shadows appear. And another family learns that some places hold on to their past so tightly, it bleeds into the present. If you're ever house hunting in Minneapolis, and you find a great deal on a colonial on Maple Street, ask about the thermostat. Ask why such a nice house has had so many owners. Ask about the empty lot half a mile away where nothing will grow. And if you don't get straight answers, walk away. Because once you move in, Once you become part of that house's story, it's already too late. The temperature will change, the dreams will start, and you'll learn what I learned. Some cold can't be warmed, some stories demand to be heard, and some houses are never truly empty. The thermostat in my new apartment stays exactly where I set it. 72 during the day, 65 at night. Never changes, never wavers. And I'm grateful for that every single night when 3 a.m. passes without incident. But sometimes, on particularly cold nights, I wake up shivering, check my phone, and for just a moment, before my eyes fully focus, I swear the temperature reads 67 degrees. They're still with me, will always be with me, because I made a promise to remember. And some promises, like some ghosts, follow you forever. So I'm telling you their story, passing it on, because maybe if enough people know, if enough people remember, they'll finally find peace. Or maybe they won't. Maybe they're doomed to haunt that land forever, changing thermostats, whispering through walls, waiting for someone else to listen. Either way, now you know. And if your thermostat ever starts changing on its own, if it goes to exactly 67 degrees every night at 3 a.m., you'll know why. You'll know who, and you'll have a choice. Stay and listen to their story, or run, like all the others, and let them fade back into the shadows, forgotten again, cold forever. The choice is yours, but choose quickly, because once the whispers start, once the shadows appear, it might already be too late. Remember them. Remember their names. Remember their stories. And whatever you do, don't let your house get to 67 degrees. What really happened at 4821 Maple Street? Was it ghosts or something else entirely? Drop a comment below with your theory. And if you've ever experienced something similar in your own home, I want to hear about it. Subscribe for more true horror stories that will keep you up at night. And hit that notification bell so you never miss an upload, because the most terrifying stories are the ones that could happen to anyone, even you. Sleep tight. Story number 3. Have you ever wondered what it would be like to know your future before it happens? What if I told you that buried beneath an old oak tree in Millbrook, Connecticut, there's a time capsule that doesn't contain memories from the past, but warnings from tomorrow? What if I told you that 3 weeks ago I dug it up? And what if I told you that everything inside it has already started coming true? My name is Sarah Chen, and I'm about to share something that will keep you awake tonight. Something that made me question everything I thought I knew about time, fate, and the thin line between coincidence and cosmic horror. By the end of the story, you'll understand why I can't sleep anymore, and why I need your help figuring out what comes next. But first, let me ask you this. If you found a newspaper dated 6 months in the future, with your name in the obituaries, would you read it? Would you believe it? Or would you do what I did, and wish you had never opened that metal box? The story I'm about to tell you happened in my hometown of Millbrook, a sleepy New England community where the biggest excitement usually comes from the annual Pumpkin Festival. But 3 weeks ago, that all changed. And now, I'm sharing this story because I need witnesses. I need people who will remember what I'm about to tell you, just in case. The story begins now. I never believed in fate until I found that time capsule. It was a Tuesday morning in late October, one of those crisp autumn days where the leaves crunch under your feet and the air smells like wood smoke and apple cider. I was walking my dog, Chester, through Millbrook Park, the same route we'd taken every morning for the past 3 years since I moved back home after college. Chester, a golden retriever with more energy than sense, had been acting strange all week. Instead of his usual enthusiastic sprint toward the duck pond, he kept pulling me toward the old oak tree near the playground. The massive tree had to be at least 200 years old, its trunk so wide that 3 people holding hands couldn't wrap their arms around it. That morning, Chester started digging frantically at the base of the tree, his paws scraping against something metallic. I tried calling him away, but he was obsessed. When I knelt down to see what had caught his attention, my fingers brushed against cold steel buried just beneath the surface. It took me 20 minutes to dig out what appeared to be a standard time capsule, the kind elementary schools bury during Earth Day celebrations. But this one was different. Instead of the usual "do not open until 2045 inches" inscription, there was something that made my blood run cold. Do not open until October 28, 2024. Today's date. I sat there in the damp leaves, holding this metal cylinder, and I felt something I can only describe as dread creeping up my spine. The rational part of my mind said it was just a coincidence. Maybe some kids had buried it as a prank. Maybe the date was a typo. But my hands were shaking as I twisted open the seal. Inside, wrapped in plastic, I found 5 items that would change everything I thought I knew about time and possibility. The first was a newspaper, the Millbrook Gazette, dated March 15, 2025. 5 months in the future. The headline read, "Local woman vanishes after discovering time anomaly." Below it, a smaller story, "Millbrook Elementary School fire claims 2 lives." The second item was a USB drive with my name written on it in my own handwriting. The third was a Polaroid photograph of me standing in my kitchen, but I was wearing clothes I'd never seen before. A red sweater I didn't own, holding a coffee mug that wasn't mine. The fourth item was a key, small, silver, with the number 247 engraved on it. The fifth item was a handwritten note, and when I unfolded it, I nearly dropped everything. Sarah, if you're reading this, then the loop is beginning again. You have exactly 127 days to figure out how to break it. The fire happens on February 14th. You can't save them by calling the fire department. You can't save them by warning the school. The only way to stop it is to find the source. Room 247. The key will get you in, but be careful who you trust. Not everyone is who they seem to be. The USB contains everything you need to know, but don't watch it alone. And whatever you do, don't let them know you have this. They're watching now. They've always been watching. You, from the 47th loop, I must have read that note 50 times. Sitting there under that ancient oak tree while Chester sat beside me, strangely calm now that the metal box was open. The handwriting was definitely mine, but I had no memory of writing those words. The idea of loops, of repeating time, of future selves leaving messages for past selves, it should have seemed ridiculous. But deep down, in a place I didn't want to acknowledge, it felt familiar. Like déjà vu, but stronger. Like a memory that hadn't happened yet. I spent the rest of that day pacing around my small apartment above the bookstore I managed, staring at the USB drive like it might explode. Every rational instinct told me to throw the whole thing away, to pretend I'd never found it. But the note had been so specific. Room 247. The fire on February 14th. 2 lives lost. What if it was real? What if, somehow, I could prevent a tragedy? By evening, I couldn't stand the uncertainty anymore. I plugged the USB into my laptop but followed the note's advice. I called my best friend Emma and asked her to come over. Emma Rodriguez had been my anchor since high school. Practical, skeptical, and unflappable. If anyone could help me make sense of this, it would be her. I'd told her I'd found something strange, but I hadn't explained the details over the phone. When she arrived with her usual arsenal of snacks and sarcasm, I showed her everything. The newspaper, the photograph, the key, the note. I watched her face cycle through disbelief, concern for my mental health, and, finally, a grudging curiosity. "Okay," she said, settling onto my couch with a bag of Chester's favorite treats. "Let's say, hypothetically, that you haven't completely lost your mind. Let's say this is real. What exactly are we dealing with here?" I inserted the USB drive. The folder contained dozens of video files, each labeled with dates stretching back months. The oldest was labeled Loop 1, June 3rd, 2024. The newest was Loop 46, October 27th, 2024. Yesterday, I clicked on the first video. My own face appeared on screen, but I looked different. Older, maybe, tired. There were dark circles under my eyes that I didn't have now, and my hair was longer than I'd worn it in years. "Hi, Sarah," the video me said, and hearing my own voice made my skin crawl. "If you're watching this, then you just found the time capsule. I know this is confusing and terrifying, but I need you to listen carefully. Time isn't linear in Millbrook. There's something here. Something that's been here for a very long time, and it's creating temporal loops. Every time we fail to stop the fire, time resets to the moment you find the capsule. You always find it on October 28th, and you always have exactly 127 days to figure out how to save those children." Emma grabbed my arm. "Sarah, this is impossible." But the video continued. "The children who die in the fire are Madison Clark and Tommy Vasquez. They're 7 years old. On February 14th, they'll be staying after school for the Valentine's Day Party Planning Committee. The fire starts in the basement, in room 247, at exactly 3:47 p.m. It spreads too fast for anyone to get to them. The official investigation always concludes it was an electrical fire, but that's not true. Someone starts it deliberately." I felt cold all over. The person who starts the fire is someone you trust, someone who's been watching you, studying you, learning from each loop. They know about the time capsule because they put it there. They're trying to drive you insane by making you relive this over and over, but I think I finally figured out who it is. The video me leaned closer to the camera. The video cut off. Emma and I sat in stunned silence. Finally, she whispered, "Check the other videos." But every single video file after that was corrupted. Dozens of files, all showing as damaged or unreadable. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? Instead, I researched everything I could about Millbrook Elementary School, about Madison Clark and Tommy Vasquez, about any mysterious fires in the area. I found Madison's Instagram. She was a bright 7-year-old who loved unicorns and wanted to be a veterinarian. Tommy was the class clown, according to his mother's Facebook posts, always making his friends laugh. They were real children. Living, breathing, laughing children who, according to a version of myself I didn't remember being, were going to die in less than 4 months. The next morning, Emma and I drove to the elementary school. It was a typical small-town school building, red brick and white trim, built in the 1960s. I'd attended there myself, back when Mrs. Henderson was still teaching 2nd grade and the playground had the old metal equipment that would probably be considered a lawsuit waiting to happen today. "We can't just break into a school," Emma whispered as we sat in her car across the street. "We're not breaking in," I said, holding up the key. "We have permission. From myself, apparently." The key worked perfectly in the main entrance. The hallways smelled exactly the same as I remembered. That particular combination of industrial cleaner, chalk dust, and the lingering aroma of cafeteria food. Our footsteps echoed as we made our way to the basement. Room 247 was tucked away in a corner I'd never explored as a student. The key opened it easily. Inside, we found what appeared to be a maintenance room. Water heater, electrical panels, cleaning supplies. But in the far corner, behind a stack of folding chairs, I noticed something that made my breath catch. A small wooden desk, out of place among the industrial equipment. On the desk was a notebook, open to a page covered in handwriting I didn't recognize. Emma read over my shoulder as I flipped through the pages. Sarah Loop 1. Discovered capsule October 28th. Showed USB to Emma. Failed to prevent fire. Reset. Sarah Loop 2. Discovered capsule October 28th. Tried calling fire department on February 14th. Failed to prevent fire. reset. Sarah Loop 3, discovered capsule October 28th. Warning school directly. Failed to prevent fire, reset. Page after page of failed attempts. Different strategies, different approaches. But always the same result. Always ending with failed to prevent fire, reset. And then on the very last page with writing, Sarah Loop, 46. She's getting suspicious. The USB corruption worked, but she's smarter than I expected. Need to accelerate timeline. Fire moved to December 20th, winter break. Fewer witnesses. She'll never expect the change. Emma's voice was barely a whisper. Sarah, if this is real, then the fire isn't in February. It's in December. Less than 2 months away. But I was staring at something else. At the bottom of the page there was a signature, a name I recognized. Emma Rodriguez. I looked at my best friend, the person I'd trusted with this impossible secret, and saw something in her eyes I'd never noticed before. A calculating coldness that made me take a step backward. Emma? I said carefully. She smiled, but it wasn't the warm smile I'd known for years. It was something else entirely. You know, Sarah, you've gotten farther than ever before. Loop 47, and you actually made it to my notebook. I'm impressed. You're the one doing this? I'm the one trying to fix this, she said, moving between me and the door. Do you know what it's like, watching your best friend slowly go insane? Loop after loop, getting more paranoid, more desperate. The first few times I tried to help you, I really did. But you kept failing, and every time you failed we'd reset, and I'd have to watch you discover that capsule all over again. I felt like the room was spinning. So, you decided to kill children. I decided to give you a mystery you could actually solve, she said. Something dramatic enough to break the loop. Don't you see? The fire was never the real problem. The real problem is that time is broken here, and the only way to fix it is to create a paradox strong enough to shatter the cycle. What happened next is something I'm still trying to understand. Emma lunged toward me, but not to hurt me, to grab something from the desk. A small device I hadn't noticed, about the size of a smartphone but covered in symbols that hurt to look at directly. This is how it works, she said, holding the device up. This is what creates the loops. I found it years ago, buried under that oak tree, long before you moved back to town. It responds to strong emotional trauma, to desperate wishes to change the past. Every time you fail to save those children, your desperation activates it, and time resets. But the children are fine, Emma said. They were never in any real danger. The fire in the newspaper, it's from a timeline that never actually happens. The device shows possible futures, probable futures, but not definite ones. I've been using it to create scenarios dramatic enough to break your fixation on saving people who were never at risk. I stared at her, trying to process what she was telling me. Then why? Why go through all of this? Because you're stuck, Sarah. You have been for months. Ever since you moved back here, you've been living the same day over and over, just not literally. Same job, same routine, same conversations. The device, it was trying to help you, showing you a future where you could be a hero, where you could save people. But every time you failed in the simulation, you'd wake up the next morning and live the same meaningless day again. The room felt like it was tilting. You're saying none of this is real? The loops are real, the device is real. Your desperation to change things, to matter, to make a difference. That's real too. But Sarah, you can't save people who aren't in danger. You can't fix a problem that doesn't exist. I looked at the device in her hands, at the symbols that seemed to shift and change when I wasn't looking directly at them. How do we stop it? We don't, Emma said sadly. We accept it. We accept that sometimes there's nothing to fix, nothing to save, nothing to change. We accept that ordinary life, boring life, safe life. Sometimes that's enough. She handed me the device. The moment my fingers touched it, I understood everything. I could feel the weight of 46 loops, 46 versions of myself desperately trying to be more than I was. I could feel the echo of futures that would never happen, tragedies that existed only in the space between possibility and reality. And I could feel the choice. Keep the device, keep the loops, keep living the same dramatic story over and over. Or let it go. I thought about Madison Clark and Tommy Vasquez, safe in their homes, unaware that in dozens of phantom timelines they'd been saved by a woman they'd never met. I thought about Emma, my real friend, who had been trying to save me from my own need to save everyone else. I thought about Chester, waiting at home, probably wondering why his walk had taken so long. I made my choice. The device felt warm as I set it gently on the desk. The symbols flickered once, twice, and then went dark. "Is it over?" I asked. Emma nodded. "It's over." We walked out of room 247 together, leaving the device behind. As we reached the main hallway, I turned back once. The basement door had already swung shut, and somehow I knew it would never open for us again. But here's the thing that's been keeping me awake these past 3 weeks. The thing that made me decide to share this story with all of you. Yesterday, October 28th, exactly 3 weeks after we left that device in room 247, Chester started digging under the oak tree again. And this time, he found a different time capsule. This one is dated November 18th, 2024. 3 weeks from now. I haven't opened it yet. I'm not sure I want to, but I keep thinking about what Emma said, about the device responding to desperation, to the wish to change things. And I keep wondering, what if sharing this story, what if reaching out to all of you, what if asking for your help, what if that's enough desperation to start the whole thing over again? What if, by telling you this story, I've already opened the new time capsule? What if you, right now, listening to this, are part of the next loop? I guess there's only one way to find out. I'm going to open it tomorrow, November 18th, at exactly 3:47 p.m. If you want to know what's inside, if you want to know what happens next, you'll have to wait for my next story. But I have a feeling that what's in this new capsule isn't about the past or the future. I think it's about right now, about this moment, about you. Sweet dreams. What do you think was in the second time capsule? What would you do if you found a message from your future self? Share your theories in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe if you want to find out what Sarah discovers next. Because something tells me this story isn't over yet. Story number 4. The cup of coffee shattered against the kitchen floor, and I swear I heard someone sigh in disappointment from the empty hallway. That was 3 weeks after I'd moved into 1247 Maple Street, and the first time I truly understood what the realtor meant when she said the house had character. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you about the day I first walked through that front door. The day I should have turned around and never looked back. My name is Sarah Chen, and I bought my first house at 32. A modest 2-story colonial in Burlington, Vermont. The kind with original hardwood floors that creak in all the right places and windows that rattle when the wind picks up. The previous owner, an elderly woman named Margaret Holloway, had passed away 6 months earlier. No family came forward to claim the property, so it went to auction. I got it for a steal, or so I thought. Now, let me be clear. I'm not the type to believe in ghosts or spirits or any of that. I'm a software developer. I believe in code, logic, and things that can be explained. But what happened in that house? Well, it changed everything I thought I knew about what's possible. The story begins now. The first week was perfect. I unpacked my boxes, arranged my furniture, and even started a small herb garden in the backyard. The neighbors were friendly enough, though they did seem to hurry past my property line, especially after dark. Mrs. Peterson from next door brought me a casserole on my second day, but she wouldn't come inside. Just handed it to me on the porch with a tight smile and practically ran back to her house. Old Margaret was particular about visitors, she'd said, glancing nervously at my front door. Very particular. I didn't think much of it then. Small towns, you know. Everyone has their quirks and their stories about the neighbors. Besides, the house felt wonderful during the day. Sunlight streamed through the old glass windows, creating these beautiful patterns on the walls. The kitchen had this vintage charm with its pale yellow cabinets and checkered floor. Even the creaky stairs felt like they were welcoming me home. But nights were different. It started with small things. The kind of things you dismiss because you're in a new place and everything feels unfamiliar. I'd hear footsteps upstairs when I was in the living room. Just the house settling, I told myself. The old heating system would kick on at odd hours, filling the rooms with these strange clicking sounds. Normal for a house built in 1952, right? Sometimes I'd catch a whiff of lavender and mothballs, even though I'd cleaned every inch of the place with lemon-scented products. Then came the morning I found my coffee mug moved. I'm very specific about my morning routine. I set up everything the night before, grind the beans, fill the water reservoir, place my favorite mug directly under the machine. That morning, my mug was on the counter 3 feet away, and a different cup, one I'd never seen before, decorated with tiny violets, sat in its place. I stood there for a full minute, trying to process what I was seeing. The violet cup was delicate, clearly vintage, with a small chip on the handle. It wasn't mine. I'd unpacked everything myself, and I definitely didn't own grandmother's china. Okay, I said out loud, because talking to yourself is totally normal when you live alone. Maybe the previous owner left some dishes in a cabinet I haven't checked. But I had checked. Every cabinet, every drawer, every closet in the house. I'm thorough like that. I even had a spreadsheet. I used the violet cup that morning. What else was I going to do? The coffee tasted different. Better, somehow. Richer. Like someone who actually knew what they were doing had made it, not just pressed a button on a machine. That evening, I found a note. It was tucked under the sugar bowl, written in careful cursive on paper that smelled faintly of roses. 2 sugars is too much, dear. Try 1.5, trust me. M. My hands shook as I read it. M. Margaret? But that was impossible. Margaret Holloway had been dead for 6 months. I'd seen the death certificate during the closing. June 15th, 2024. Heart failure. Died in her sleep, right here in this house. I did what any rational person would do. I installed security cameras. If someone was playing pranks, I'd catch them. If I was somehow sleepwalking and leaving myself notes, well, I'd catch that too. The cameras revealed nothing. Or rather, they revealed too much nothing. Every night at exactly 2:17 a.m. they would glitch. Just static for about 30 minutes. When they came back online, small things would be different. A book moved from the coffee table to the shelf. The throw blanket folded differently. Fresh flowers in the vase I'd left empty. Always small things, always caring things. But there was something else the cameras caught. Something I didn't notice until I reviewed the footage for the 3rd time. In the moments just before the static, if you looked carefully, really carefully, you could see a shadow. Not cast by anything in the room. Just a shadow, moving with purpose, always starting from the kitchen. I decided to test something. One night, I left a mess on purpose. Dirty dishes in the sink, papers scattered on the dining table, shoes kicked off in the living room. I even spilled some juice on the counter and didn't clean it up, which went against every fiber of my being, but this was science. Sort of. I stayed awake that night, hidden in my bedroom with my laptop watching the camera feeds. At 2:16 a.m., I held my breath. 2:17 a.m. Static, but this time, just before the feed cut out, I saw her. Clear as day for just a fraction of a second. An elderly woman in a house dress, her gray hair in perfect curls, reaching for the dirty dishes with a look of gentle disapproval on her face. Margaret. 3 weeks in, I started talking to her. I know how that sounds, but when you're alone in a house with a helpful ghost, what else are you supposed to do? "Margaret?" I'd say while making dinner. "I'm using your kitchen. I hope that's okay." No response, of course. But the next morning, I'd find my spice rack reorganized. The paprika moved next to the cumin, the oregano next to the basil. It made more sense her way. I started leaving notes back. "Thank you for organizing the spices." I'd write. The coffee tip was perfect. "Your violet cup is lovely." She never responded directly, but I'd find little gifts. A recipe card tucked into my cookbook for Margaret's famous pot roast. A lavender sachet in my drawer to help me sleep. Once, I found an old photo on my pillow. A young woman in a 1960s dress standing in front of my house, smiling brilliantly at the camera. I Googled Margaret Holloway after that. Found her obituary, a few mentions in the local paper. She'd been a librarian, never married, lived in this house for over 50 years. The photo showed her receiving an award for community service in 1987. She'd organized reading programs for kids, delivered books to shut-ins, kept the library open during budget cuts by volunteering unpaid hours. She'd been kind. That's what everyone said about her. Unfailingly, remarkably kind. But there was more. The deeper I dug, the stranger the stories became. Margaret had been adopted, raised by a woman who died when Margaret was just 17. She'd inherited this house and never left, never traveled, never married, though there were whispers of a fiancé who'd disappeared one summer in 1971. Left town, the old newspaper said. No forwarding address. The coexistence was pleasant. Is that weird to say? I'd come home from work to find fresh cookies on the counter, still warm. My laundry would be folded when I knew I'd left it in a heap. The house always smelled like home, even though I'd only lived there a month. I started telling her about my day. Silly, I know, but it felt rude not to. I'd sit at the kitchen table with my dinner and just talk. "The Peterson kid knocked over my trash cans again," I'd say. "I know he's just being a kid, but it's annoying." The next morning, my trash cans would be secured with bungee cords I didn't buy. Work was rough today. The code review went badly. I'd find my laptop moved to the desk by the window, a cup of tea waiting, and somehow my code would have comments, helpful ones, in that same careful cursive but digital. Impossible, but there they were. / Consider restructuring this function, dear. Recursion would be more elegant. She was right. She was always right. But then I started finding other things, personal things. My journal, which I kept hidden in my nightstand, would be left open on my bed. Always to pages where I'd written about feeling lonely, about missing my ex, about wondering if I'd made the right choice moving to Vermont. Beside the journal, there'd be a cup of cocoa and a note. "You're not alone, dear. You're home now." It should have been creepy. It was creepy. But it was also comforting. I'd lived alone for years, but I'd never felt less lonely than I did in that haunted house with my ghostly roommate who cared too much. One night, I brought someone home. Jake from the coffee shop. We'd been flirting for weeks, and he finally asked me out. Dinner went well, really well. Well enough that I invited him back for a drink. The moment we walked through the door, the temperature dropped. The lights flickered. And Jake's nose started bleeding, just gushing blood out of nowhere. "Oh my God!" I grabbed paper towels, tried to help him, but he was already backing toward the door. I need to go," he said, his voice shaky. "I don't feel this house doesn't..." He left, practically ran. And as I stood in my doorway watching his taillights disappear, I heard it. Soft humming from the kitchen. A satisfied sound. Like a grandmother who'd successfully scared off an unsuitable boyfriend. "Margaret," I said firmly, "that wasn't okay." The humming stopped. A note appeared on the hall table. "He wasn't good enough for you, dear. Trust me. I know these things." But then things started to change. It was subtle at first. The helpful notes became more frequent, more insistent. You should eat more vegetables. That young man from the coffee shop isn't right for you. Why did you stay out so late? I was worried. The gifts became corrections. I'd put a book on the shelf, and it would be moved to where Margaret thought it should go. I'd hang a picture, and it would be straightened, or removed entirely. My modern art print vanished completely, replaced by a cross-stitch sampler reading Home Sweet Home. I started finding my phone hidden when I needed to make calls. My car keys would disappear when I had plans to go out. The Wi-Fi would mysteriously stop working whenever I tried to browse apartment listings, just to see what else was available, just to have options. "Margaret," I said one night, frustration creeping into my voice, "this is my house now. I need to make it mine." The temperature dropped 20 degrees in seconds. Every light in the house flickered. And then silence. No helpful notes for 3 days. No organized spice racks. No fresh cookies. But the silence was worse than the attention. It was heavy, oppressive, like the house itself was holding its breath. Waiting, watching. I caught glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision. Shadows that shouldn't be there. Reflections in windows that didn't match what was behind me. On the third night, I found all my modern furniture pushed against the walls. In the center of my living room sat antique pieces I'd never seen before. A Victorian sofa. A grandfather clock that tick-tocked with aggressive precision. A rocking chair that moved slightly, as if someone had just gotten up from it. "I'm sorry," I said on the third night. "I didn't mean to be rude. I appreciate everything you do, really." The house warmed slightly. The next morning, there was a note. "I just want things to be perfect for you, dear, the way they should be." But perfect for who? That was the question that started haunting me, because I was beginning to realize that Margaret's help came with expectations. Margaret's kindness came with control. I started researching the house's history more intensively. The library had old records, property deeds, newspaper archives. What I found made my skin crawl. 1973, Janet Mills moves in. Single woman, nurse at the local hospital. After 6 months, she stops showing up for work. Neighbors report she's become reclusive. Found dead 2 years later. Heart failure. 1988, the Chens move in. Young couple expecting their first child. They break their lease after 3 months, forfeiting their deposit. When asked why, Mrs. Chen reportedly said, "That house doesn't want a family. It wants..." She never finished the sentence. 1995, Robert Garcia, widower, retires to Burlington. Moves into 1247 Maple Street. His children report he stops returning calls, stops visiting. When they finally come to check on him, they find him in perfect health, but refuse to leave the house. "She needs me," he keeps saying. Dies 6 years later. Heart failure. Always single people or widowers. Always people who stayed until they died. Always heart failure. I started testing boundaries. I'd leave things deliberately messy just to see. They'd be cleaned up by morning, but now I could feel the disapproval in the air. Heavy, suffocating disapproval. The kind your grandmother gives you when you've disappointed her. I bought new curtains. Bright, modern ones, to replace the lace she'd favored. I woke up at 3 a.m. to the sound of fabric tearing. The new curtains were shredded, the old lace ones back in place. "Margaret, stop!" I shouted into the darkness. A voice, barely a whisper, seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. "Those weren't right, dear. Trust me. I know what's best." I started spending more time away from home. Late nights at the office, weekends with friends. But I'd always have to come back, and when I did, the house felt angry. Doors would slam. Cold spots would follow me from room to room. Once, I swear I felt hands on my shoulders, pressing down, trying to push me into a chair at the kitchen table where dinner was waiting. Her dinner. Always her recipes, always her portions, always her schedule. I I stopped eating at home, started getting takeout, eating in my car, but the food would spoil instantly when I brought it inside. Milk would curdle, bread would mold, fresh fruit would rot in minutes. Only Margaret's cooking remained fresh. Only Margaret's meals were allowed. "This isn't your house anymore," I said one night, my voice shaking. "You're dead, Margaret. You need to move on." Every dish in the kitchen exploded. Not fell, exploded, shards of ceramic everywhere, and in the center of the chaos that violet cup sat untouched, mocking me. The next morning I found a note that made my blood run cold. "I never left, dear. Why would I? This is my home. You're just a guest who's overstayed their welcome." That's when I understood. I wasn't a homeowner, I was a replacement. Another in a long line of people Margaret had collected, kept, controlled until they couldn't leave anymore. I tried to leave, packed my bags, called a hotel, but my car wouldn't start. My phone died despite being fully charged. The front door wouldn't open. The knob turned, the lock clicked, but the door wouldn't budge, like someone was holding it shut from the other side. "Let me go, Margaret," I pleaded. The house creaked and groaned around me. Whispers seemed to seep from the walls. "But who will take care of you? Who will make sure you eat properly? Who will keep you safe? I can take care of myself." "Can you?" The whisper was closer now, right by my ear. "Look how thin you've gotten. Look how tired. You need me, Sarah. Just like all the others needed me." Others? What others? That's when I saw them, really saw them. In the reflections of the windows, in the shadows on the walls, faint outlines of people. Janet Mills in her nurse's uniform, standing by the kitchen sink. Robert Garcia in his armchair, staring at nothing. Others I didn't recognize. All transparent. All trapped. "No," I whispered. "No, they didn't die. You kept them. You're keeping them still." "They're happy," Margaret's voice insisted. "They're home, their family. My family, forever." I ran to my laptop, thankful it still worked. Started researching. Not just Margaret Holloway, but the house, its history, its previous occupants. What I found made my stomach turn. 1952 to 1973. The Thompsons. Moved out suddenly, leaving half their belongings. 1973 to 1988. Janet Mills. Died in the house. Heart failure. 1988 to 1995. The Chens. No relation to me despite the name. Broke their lease, paid penalty, refused to say why. 1995 to 2001. Robert Garcia. Died in the house. Heart failure. 2001 to 2024. Margaret Holloway. Died in the house. Heart. I stopped reading. Heart failure. Always heart failure. Always in the house. But there was more. Margaret's adoptive mother, Rose Holloway, died in 1968. In the house. Heart failure. And before that, Rose's aunt who'd left her the house, died in 1951. In the house. Heart failure. Oh my God, I breathed. "It's not you, it's the house. The house has been doing this for decades." "No." Margaret's voice was sharp now, defensive. "I take care of people, I give them a home, I give them love. You give them prison," I shot back, "just like someone gave you." The house shuddered. And suddenly, I could see Margaret clearly. Not the elderly woman who died 6 months ago, but all of her. The 17-year-old who'd lost her mother. The 30-year-old who'd waited for a fiancé who never came back. The 50-year-old who'd given up on life outside these walls. The 70-year-old who died alone, surrounded by the ghosts of people she'd trapped, trying not to be lonely. "I don't know any other way," she said, and she was crying. "This is all I know, taking care of people, keeping them close, making sure they never leave me." "But they're not really here," I said gently. "You're holding on to echoes, shadows. You're as trapped as they are." At least I'm not alone, she whispered. I looked around at the shadows, at Janet, at Robert, at the others whose names I didn't know. They weren't looking at Margaret with love. They were looking at her with pity and fear. Yes, you are, I said. You're the loneliest person I've ever met. The house began to shake. Pictures fell from walls. Plaster cracked. And through it all, that violent cup sat on the counter, the only still point in the chaos. I understood then. The cup wasn't just Margaret's anchor, it was the house's anchor. Passed down from owner to owner. Rose to Margaret. Margaret to me. They needed me, Margaret's voice wailed. They were so lost, so helpless. I took care of them until the end. Such good guests, so grateful, not like you. I wasn't going to be another name on that list. I grabbed a baseball bat from the closet. Not sure what good it would do against a ghost, but it made me feel better, and headed for the windows. If the door wouldn't open, I'd make my own exit. The bat went through the glass easily enough. But as I tried to climb out, invisible hands pulled me back. Strong hands. Desperate hands. You can't leave? The voice wasn't a whisper anymore. It was a wail, a shriek that made the whole house shake. No one leaves. This is home. This is where you belong. Pictures fell from the walls. In the chaos, I saw them clearly for the first time. Not just Margaret's photos, but others. Janet Mills, Robert Garcia, people I didn't recognize. All smiling, all standing in front of this house, all looking somehow trapped behind the glass. You killed them, I gasped. You killed them all. I took care of them. Margaret's voice was everywhere now, vibrating through the floorboards. I gave them everything. Love, attention, home-cooked meals, and they were grateful. They stayed until the end. The house was coming alive around me. Furniture moving, blocking my path to the broken window, doors slamming, lights flashing. And in the center of it all, that violet cup sitting on the kitchen counter, steaming with fresh coffee. Drink, the voice commanded. Drink and be grateful, drink and stay, drink and be mine. I ran for the cup, not to drink, but to smash it. Something told me it was important. Her anchor, maybe, the thing that kept her here. But as my hands closed around it, I felt her, really felt her. Not just cold air or invisible hands, but her. Margaret Holloway, 60 years of loneliness and twisted love wrapped around that delicate porcelain, and more. I felt Rose Holloway and her aunt before her. Generations of lonely women, each trapping the next, each thinking they were showing love when they were spreading a curse. Please, Margaret whispered. And for a moment, I saw her clearly. Not the old woman, but all of them. All the women who'd been trapped in this house, who'd learned that love meant control, that care meant captivity. Please, don't leave me alone. I've been alone for so long. My grip on the cup loosened. Despite everything, I felt pity. She wasn't evil. She was just broken, loving in all the wrong ways, holding on when she should have let go. Margaret, I said softly, this isn't love. This is prison for them and for you. And for I don't know any other way, she admitted. And I could see tears on her translucent cheeks. This house, it's all I have, all I've ever had. Then let me help you, I said. Let me help you leave. The house stilled. Margaret stared at me, confusion and hope warring on her face. Leave? She repeated, like she'd never considered it. But where would I go? I thought of the photos, the library, the children she'd read to, the community she'd served. To the people who really loved you, the ones who remember Margaret the librarian, not Margaret the ghost, the ones who are waiting for you, somewhere else. But what about them? She gestured to the shadows. I can't leave them. You have to let them go first, I said. All of them. Free them and free yourself. The cup in my hands pulsed. Hot, then cold, then hot again. Like a heartbeat, like generations of heartbeats. I don't know how, Margaret whispered. Yes, you do, I said. Just let go. She looked at me for a long moment, then at the shadows around us. Janet Mills nodded. Robert Garcia smiled sadly. The others waited. Will you remember me? She asked. The real me, not this thing I've become. I'll remember the cookies, I promised, and the coffee tips and the organized spice rack. I'll remember the kindness, Margaret, just the kindness. She smiled then. A real smile, not the desperate rictus I'd glimpsed in shadows. And then she let go. The cup didn't shatter, it simply faded, became transparent, then translucent, then nothing at all. And with it went the weight in the air, the watching presence, the desperate need that had saturated every board and brick of the house. The shadows faded too, one by one, like candles being blown out. Janet, Robert, the others. Free at last. Margaret Holloway was the last to go. She looked around the house one more time, then at me. Take care of it, she said, but don't let it take care of you. And then she was gone. Really gone this time. I stood in my kitchen, for a long moment, just breathing. Then I walked to the front door. It opened easily, spilling morning sunlight across the threshold. I stayed. Crazy, right? But I stayed. The house feels different now. Lighter. Sometimes I still smell lavender, but it's gentle. A memory, not a presence. I reorganized the spice rack my own way, but I kept her recipe cards. Her pot roast really is famous-worthy. The neighbors don't hurry past anymore. Mrs. Peterson even comes in for coffee sometimes. She uses my mugs, not violet cups that appear from nowhere. But sometimes when I'm making my morning coffee, I use 1.5 sugars instead of 2, just because she was right. She was right about that one thing. Though I have to wonder. When I woke up this morning, there was a new house for sale sign 3 doors down. The Millers are moving out, suddenly, leaving half their furniture behind. And yesterday, I could have sworn I smelled lavender coming from their yard. But that's not the strangest part. The strangest part is what I found in my basement last week. Behind the water heater, wrapped in oilcloth. Another cup, older than Margaret's. Blue roses instead of violets. And inside it, a note. For the next one, with love. R.H. Rose Holloway. Margaret's mother. I should have destroyed it. Should have smashed it to pieces and scattered them in running water or something. But I didn't. I wrapped it back up, put it back behind the water heater. Because someday, someone else might need to make a choice. Someone else might need to break a chain. Or maybe some chains are meant to be passed on. Changed, softened, but not broken. Maybe that's how we heal generational wounds. Not by destroying them, but by transforming them. I don't know, I'm still figuring it out. But I can tell you this, my house has character. It takes care of me, but only as much as I let it. And every morning, when I make my coffee with 1.5 sugars, I think about loneliness, about love, about the difference between holding on and holding captive. Tell me, does your house have character? Does it take care of you just a little too well? Do you ever wonder who lived there before? And if they ever really left? And more importantly, what will you leave behind for the next owner? Leave a comment below. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Because I don't think Margaret was the only one who loved a little too much and held on a little too long. And sometimes, late at night, when the wind is just right, I could swear I hear other houses in the neighborhood whispering, calling, waiting for their next guest. Sweet dreams. Unless, of course, your house won't let you sleep. But that's a different story entirely. Or is it? Story number 5. Listen closely, because what I'm about to tell you happened just 3 weeks ago. and I still can't sleep without checking my windows. Twice, maybe 3 times. The police in Cedar Hollow, Maine, they think I'm crazy. My therapist, she thinks it's stress from the divorce. But I know what I saw, what I measured, what left those marks in my garden. If you're listening to this alone, maybe turn on another light, just in case. And now, our story begins. The morning I found them, the coffee maker was doing that thing again. That gurgling, choking sound that meant I'd forgotten to clean it. Again. Sarah would have remembered. Sarah always remembered things like that. But Sarah was living with her personal trainer in Portland now, and I was here in this too-big house forgetting to clean the coffee maker. Cedar Hollow isn't the kind of place where things happen. Population 2,847. 1 traffic light. 3 churches. A diner that still serves meatloaf on Wednesdays. I moved here specifically because nothing happens here. After 20 years as a systems analyst in Boston, I wanted nothing. I wanted quiet. I wanted to grow tomatoes and read books, and maybe, just maybe, figure out who I was without Sarah. The house came with 2 acres. The realtor, this overly cheerful woman named Dottie, she kept saying it was perfect for a fresh start. I remember thinking that was such a cliché. But standing in that backyard, looking at the raised garden beds the previous owner had built, I could see it. My fresh start. My quiet life. I was wrong. That morning, October 15th, the sun was doing that thing where it comes through the trees all golden and perfect. You know those mornings, where everything feels possible. I took my terrible coffee out to the back deck, still in my pajamas and those ridiculous llama slippers my sister gave me last Christmas. The air had that sharp October smell. Leaves and frost and something else. Something I couldn't place. The garden beds were my pride and joy. Even in October, I still had winter squash growing, some late-season kale, and these beautiful purple cabbages that looked like something from a fairy tale. I'd spent all summer learning. YouTube videos, library books, asking questions at the farmer's market until vendors started hiding when they saw me coming. But that morning, something was wrong. At first, I thought it was deer. We get them here. They come down from the hills, eat everything in sight. But as I walked closer, my coffee mug slipped. Just a little. Enough to spill on those ridiculous slippers. The prints were wrong. Have you ever seen a bear print? They're big. Bigger than you'd think. But these made bear prints look like a toddler's footprint in sand. Each one was maybe 18 inches long. Maybe more. The toes, if you could call them toes, they were too long, too spread out, like someone had taken a human foot and stretched it. Pulled it like taffy until it was wrong. Just wrong. 5 toes. But the spacing, the proportions. I stood there, coffee cooling in my hand, counting them. 1 set of prints, starting at the tree line, moving through my garden, stopping at each bed like whatever made them had been shopping, browsing. The squash vines were torn, not eaten, torn, pulled up and discarded. The kale, untouched, but the cabbages, all 6 of my purple cabbages, gone, not a leaf left. The prints led to the garden, and then they just stopped, right in the middle of my yard, as if whatever made them had simply disappeared. I should have called someone then. Should have gone inside, should have done anything except what I did. I got my tape measure, 22 inches. That's how long the biggest print was, 22 inches of something. The width at the widest point, 8 inches. I took photos, dozens of them, used a quarter for scale, then a dollar bill, then my own size 11 foot, which looked child-sized in comparison. The depth, that's what really got me. These prints were pressed deep into the soil. Whatever made them was heavy, really heavy. I'm 200 pounds. Not proud of it, but stress eating is real. And my footprints barely made a dent next to these. I called the police, of course I did. Officer Brennan came out, this kid who looked like he was playing dress-up in his dad's uniform. He took one look at the prints and said, "Bear. Bears don't have feet like this," I told him. He did that thing, that smile, that's not really a smile. "Sir, have you been drinking?" "It's 9 in the morning." "Right, well, bears around here, they can get pretty big. Probably just looks weird because of the mud. I'll file a report." He left. I knew he wouldn't file anything. I spent the rest of that day online. Do you know how many cryptid sighting websites there are? Hundreds, thousands maybe, Bigfoot, Sasquatch, Wendigo, skinwalkers, each one with blurry photos and stories from people who sounded, well, they sounded like me. Desperate to be believed, desperate for an explanation, but none of their footprint photos looked like mine. That night, I barely slept. Every sound, every creak of this old house. I was sure it was coming back. I set up my laptop in the kitchen, pointed the webcam at the garden. Recorded all night, nothing. The next morning, I watched 8 hours of footage at double speed. Just my garden. Still, silent. The motion sensor light came on twice. Both times, just a raccoon. A normal, explicable raccoon doing normal raccoon things. I started to think maybe Officer Brennan was right. Maybe I was seeing things. Stress from the divorce. Living alone, too much time to think. Then I found the second set of prints. These were different. Smaller. If you can call 16 inches small, leading from the garden to my greenhouse. The door was open. I always lock that door, always. My tools are in there, expensive tools. But nothing was missing, nothing was broken. Except my gardening journal. I kept it on the potting bench, tracked everything, planting dates, weather, harvest yields, boring stuff. It was moved, opened, dirt smudged on the pages, like something with dirty hands had been reading it. The page it was open to, October 10th. The day I'd written about the purple cabbages being ready to harvest. My hands shook as I flipped through the pages. Other entries had smudges too, specific entries, all about vegetables. What was ready, what was growing, what I'd planted where. I called my sister in Burlington, tried to sound casual. "Hey, Ellen. Weird question. Do bears, can they read?" "What?" "David, are you okay?" "I'm fine. Just humor me." "Bears can't read, David. Are you sure you're okay? You sound odd." I told her I was fine. Told her it was just a weird dream I'd had. But after I hung up, I sat in my kitchen and stared at that journal for a long time. Something had been in my greenhouse. Something that could open doors. Something that could turn pages. Something that was interested in my vegetables. Something that wasn't a bear. I installed cameras. 6 of them. Covered every angle of the yard. Cost me a fortune, but Sarah got the savings account, so credit cards it was. The guy at the electronics store, Rick, his name was. He asked if I was worried about intruders. Something like that, I told him. He recommended motion sensors too, the kind that send alerts to your phone. I bought those too, installed them myself. Spent a whole Saturday up on ladders, running cables, downloading apps. My neighbor, Mrs. Chen, she watched from her window. I waved. She closed the curtain. Small towns, everyone talks. I knew they were talking about me. The divorced guy from Boston who thinks monsters are stealing his vegetables. For 3 nights, nothing. Just alerts every time a leaf moved. I'd jump out of bed, check my phone, and see a cat, a possum. Once, a really fat raccoon that seemed personally offended by the camera. I started to relax. Started to think maybe I'd imagined it all. Stress does things to you, I know that. I've read the articles. WebMD is a dangerous place at 3 a.m. Then, October 19th, 2:47 a.m. The alert woke me. Motion detected. Back garden. I grabbed my phone, opened the app, and the camera was dark. All of them were dark, but I could hear something through the audio. Breathing. Heavy, wet breathing, like a dog, but bigger, much bigger. And then humming, soft, tuneless humming. The kind of sound you make when you're happy, when you're enjoying yourself. The breathing got closer to the camera, closer, until it was all I could hear. And then, good to grow? The words were wrong, stretched out like someone talking through water, or like something trying to use vocal cords it wasn't meant to have. The feed cut out. I sat in my bed, phone in my hand for maybe 5 minutes, just frozen. Then I did the stupidest thing I've ever done in my life. I got up, put on my robe and those stupid llama slippers, grabbed the baseball bat I keep by the bed, another divorce gift from Sarah's lawyer, and went outside. The motion lights were on, all of them, blazing like daylight. And in my garden, it was there. I want to be clear about what I saw, because I've spent 3 weeks trying to convince myself I didn't see it, but I did. I saw it. It was crouched in my garden, massive, maybe 8 feet tall, even hunched over, covered in, not fur, not exactly, more like, have you ever seen Spanish moss, that gray-green stuff that hangs from trees? Like that, but moving, breathing. Its hands, they weren't hands, were buried in my carrot bed, pulling them up one by one, examining them, discarding the small ones, keeping the large ones. It was selecting, choosing, like I do at the grocery store. I must have made a sound, a gasp, something, because it turned, the face, I can't describe the face. Not because I don't remember. I remember every detail, but because there aren't words. It was almost human, almost, but stretched, wrong. The eyes too far apart, the mouth too wide, and the teeth, so many teeth. But it was the expression that got me. It wasn't hostile, wasn't angry, it looked embarrassed, like I'd caught it doing something it shouldn't. We stared at each other, me in my llama slippers holding a baseball bat. It, crouched in my garden, holding my carrots. Then it spoke, that same watery, wrong voice. Sorry to disturb. And it stood up, unfolded, kept unfolding, taller than I'd thought, so much taller. It took 3 steps that covered my entire yard, and was gone, just gone, into the tree line, into the dark. I stood there until the sun came up, until Mrs. Chen came out to get her newspaper and saw me, still in my robe, still holding that bat. She didn't wave this time, just grabbed her paper and ran back inside. The cameras were fried, all of them, the memory cards blank, like they'd been hit by lightning, but there'd been no storm. The only evidence was the prints, deeper this time, and the carrots, my perfect October carrots. The big ones were gone. The small ones, arranged, lined up by size, like someone had been sorting them. I didn't sleep for 2 days. Couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that face. That horrible, almost human face. And the embarrassment in its eyes. That was the worst part. It had been embarrassed. I thought about leaving, packing up, running back to Boston. But where would I go? Sarah got the condo. I'd sink everything into this house. This fresh start. On the 3rd night, exhaustion won. I passed out on the couch, TV still on, half-eaten Chinese takeout on the coffee table. Woke up at 3 a.m. to silence. The TV was off. The takeout was gone. Not just the food, the containers, gone. And on my coffee table, vegetables. My vegetables. Arranged like a bouquet. Carrots, the big ones I'd lost. 3 purple cabbages, slightly wilted but whole. And a note. I say note. It was a piece of bark. Birch, I think. With symbols carved into it. Not letters, not any language I recognized. But somehow I understood it. The way you understand a feeling. The way you understand a dream. Thank you for growing. Sorry for taking. Trade, under the vegetables, seeds. Dozens of them. Unlike anything I'd ever seen. Iridescent, shifting colors in the lamplight. Beautiful and wrong at the same time. I should have thrown them away, should have burned them, should have called someone, anyone. But I didn't, because I remembered that embarrassment in its eyes, that careful sorting of my carrots, the word sorry in that impossible voice. The next morning, yesterday morning, I planted 3 seeds, just 3, in the greenhouse in separate pots, labeled them unknown #1, #2, #3. Like a proper gardener, like this was normal. They sprouted overnight. All 3. Plants I can't identify, don't match anything in my gardening books. Don't match anything online. They're beautiful. Leaves that seem to glow in the dark. Stems that hum when you water them. And they're growing. Fast. So fast. I haven't seen it again, haven't heard it, but I know it's watching, waiting. I can feel it sometimes at the edge of the woods, that presence, that wrongness that's becoming familiar. Last night, I left a basket at the edge of my garden, filled it with vegetables, the last of my October harvest. This morning, it was gone, replaced with more seeds. Different this time, smaller, with a new piece of bark, new symbols. But I understood these too. Friends now grow together. I'm going to plant them, all of them. God help me, I'm going to plant them. Because I'm curious, because I'm lonely, because in 3 weeks the only thing that's shown interest in my garden, in me, is a monster. Or maybe it's not a monster. Maybe it's just different, lost, hungry, trying to find food in a world that isn't made for it. I understand that feeling. Being somewhere you don't fit, trying to make it work anyway. The police haven't come back. Mrs. Chen still won't look at me. The town thinks I'm crazy, and maybe I am. Maybe stress and loneliness have finally broken something in my brain. But those plants are real, growing in my greenhouse, humming their strange songs, and tonight, I'm going to leave another basket, with a note of my own, written on paper because I don't know how to carve bark. Thank you for the seeds. What do they grow? I know it can read, I know it understands. And I know this is dangerous, stupid. Every horror movie I've ever seen is screaming at me to stop, to leave, to burn it all and run. But I'm not going to. Because for the first time since Sarah left, I'm not alone. Even if my only company is a thing with too many teeth and impossible footprints. Is that sad? Probably. Is it insane? Definitely. But it's my choice, my garden, my monsters. So, I'll keep growing, keep trading, keep leaving baskets at the edge of the dark. And maybe one day it'll tell me its name. Tell me where it came from. Tell me why it chose my garden. Until then, I have seeds to plant. Strange, impossible seeds that hum in the dark. And footprints to measure, always bigger, always deeper, always leading from the forest to my door. But not inside, never inside. It's polite, my monster. It knows boundaries. It says sorry. It trades fair. And in this empty house, in this too quiet town, in this life I'm trying to rebuild, that's enough. For now, that's enough. But if you're listening to this, if you have a garden, if you live near woods, watch for the footprints, the ones too big to be human, too careful to be animal. And if you find them, if you see them, leave out some vegetables, the big ones. It prefers the big ones, and wait, be patient, be kind. You might be surprised what grows from darkness, what friendships bloom in impossible soil. Or maybe you'll be smart. Maybe you'll run. Maybe you'll call the police and move away and never look back. But me, I'm staying, I'm growing, I'm waiting for tonight. For the basket to disappear. For new seeds to appear. For another message and symbols I shouldn't understand. Because I've been alone for 6 months. And being alone with a monster, it's better than being alone with nothing at all. Just remember, not all footprints lead to fear. Sometimes Sometimes they lead to the strangest gardens, the most impossible friendships, the most beautiful, terrifying truth. We're not alone, none of us, ever. Something's always watching, always waiting, always hoping for someone to leave out a basket, to plant a seed, to say, friends now. So what will you do when you find the footprints, when you hear the humming, when something impossible offers you seeds that glow in the dark? Will you run, or will you grow? The choice is always yours. But if you choose to grow, if you choose to stay, leave a comment. Tell me I'm not crazy. Tell me I'm not alone. Tell me your monster stories, your impossible gardens, your midnight trades. Because it's 3 a.m. as I finish typing this, and I can hear it, in the garden, humming, waiting. My basket is full, my courage is thin, but my curiosity is stronger than my fear. Time to go, time to trade, time to see what grows from darkness. Wish me luck, or wish me sense, either way. I'll let you know what happens, if I can, if it lets me, if the seeds don't change me too much. But I think they will. I think that's the point. I think that's always been the point. Change, growth, finding light in impossible places, even if that light hums, even if it has too many teeth, even if it leaves footprints that are too large to be human. Especially then, the basket is calling, the night is waiting, and somewhere in the darkness, my friend is hungry. Time to feed the impossible. Time to grow. Time to become something new. What did you think? Are you still listening? Still breathing? Check your windows. Check your garden. And tell me, what's growing in your darkness? What footprints have you been ignoring? What seeds are you afraid to plant? Share this story if it made your heart race, if it made you think, if it made you wonder what's really out there. Because the truth is, we all have monsters. The question is, will we feed them, or will we starve? The choice is yours, but choose quickly. Dawn is coming. And some things only bloom in darkness. Sweet dreams, if you can manage them. And remember, not all monsters are enemies. Sometimes they're just hungry gardeners, looking for a friend, looking for someone who understands, looking for you.